Why all the stories in the world are called Ananse stories. Once upon a time, Ananse the spider was worried. He wanted to be the keeper of all the stories in the world. However, all the stories in the world already belonged to Nananyame, whose other name is Almighty God. Ananse wondered how to ask for the title. He put on his human form and went to Nananyame's palace. "How may I help you?" Nananyame asked. I would like you to make me the keeper of all the stories in the world, Ananse said. "You have asked for a hard thing," Nananyame said. "But I will give you the title if you can bring 4 things to me." "I can bring anything you ask for," Ananse boasted. Nananyame looked at Ananse's big head. It was like a big coconut. He looked at his big round stomach. It was like a pot of rotten water. Then he looked at his tiny arms and legs. They looked like tree branches. He wondered whether Ananse could complete the tasks. Stronger, braver men had failed at it. "I will give him a chance anyway," he thought. He said to Ananse, "Firstly, you must bring Mr. Python. Secondly, you must bring Mr. Bee and his family. Thirdly, you must bring Mr. Leopard. Lastly, you must bring Mr. Dwarf." "What easy tasks," Ananse boasted. "Of course, I can bring all these as easily as this," he said, snapping his fingers. "In fact, I can even bring Mr. Elephant if you want." But Nananyame did not want Mr. Elephant. In spite of all his boasting, as soon as Ananse left the palace, he put both hands on his head and wailed as tears rolled down his cheeks. Yeah. Such hard tasks. How can I bring all this? He wailed like this until he got home. "What is the matter?" his wife also asked. Ananse told her that he must bring Mr. Python to Nananyame. "Now how will I catch Mr. Python?" he asked, and wailed again. Grunted Aso. "I can't believe you're crying over such an easy task." Ananse looked at her in surprise. "Catching Mr. Python is not such a big deal," Aso said. "I know how to catch him easily." Ananse was amazed. "Yes," Aso said, "I will tell you how." And she whispered some things in his ears. Oh my, Ananse said. "I should have thought of this before." The next morning, Ananse and Aso walked towards Mr. Python's house. As they neared the house, they began to argue. "Mr. Python, it's very, very, very long," Ananse said loudly. "Mr. Python is long, but he is not very, very, very long," Aso argued even louder. "Oh, yes, he is." "Oh, no, he isn't." "Oh, yes, he is." "Oh, no, he isn't." Aso and Ananse argued back and forth until it looked like they were having a proper quarrel. Mr. Python was in his hut when he heard the argument. How rude, he thought to himself. Of course, I am very, very, very long. He slithered out of his hut. "Look!" Ananse yelled. "There is Mr. Python. Let's ask him if he is very, very, very long." "Of course," Mr. Python said, stretching himself out. "Just look at me." Aso burst into laughter. "I will only believe you if you allow yourself to be measured against the longest palm frond in this village." "Sure, go ahead," Mr. Python boasted. "Bring whatever palm frond you can." Ananse went into the forest. He cut 2 of the longest palm fronds he could find and tied them end on end so they looked like one long palm frond. Then he brought it to the python. "Now let's measure you against this palm frond," he said. Mr. Python stretched himself against the length of the palm frond. Anytime his head moved past the upper part of the palm frond, his tail shifted away from the lower end of it. "You were almost as long as the palm frond, but you were not longer than it," Aso mocked. "Stretch a bit more," Ananse encouraged. Mr. Python stretched some more. "Stretch!" Mr. Python stretched even more. "Mr. Python, stretch!" Ananse said. Mr. Python stretched with all his might until his veins stood out and his eyes almost popped. "Stretch!" Ananse said. Mr. Python stretched even longer. He stretched until even Aso feared that he would snap into 2. "Wait," Ananse said. "Let me tie you to the palm frond when you stretch. That way we can know your true length." The python allowed himself to be tied. Ananse tied his head, his middle, and his tail to the palm frond. The 3 knots were very tight. "Now, that is way too tight," Mr. Python said to Ananse. "Loosen the knots a bit." But Ananse and Aso burst into laughter. "Ha ha ha! What a vain python you are," Ananse said. "This is nothing but a trap. Nananyami wants me to bring a python to him." The python was angered by the deceit. He tried to free himself, but he couldn't. Ananse carried him to Nananyami. Nananyami was so surprised to see Ananse coming with Mr. Python. "Well done," he said. "Now you must bring Mr. B and his whole family." "That is no problem at all," Ananse bragged. "Such a simple task indeed." But when he got outside the palace, he put both hands on his head and wailed as tears rolled down his cheeks. What a hard task! How on earth can I fill a whole god with bees? "What is it?" his wife Aso asked when he got home. "Nananyami wants me to bring Mr. B and his whole family," Ananse wailed. "Is that why you're so sad?" Aso asked. "You're always crying over easy tasks," she said scornfully. Ananse looked at her in surprise. "Catching Mr. B and his family is such an easy task," she said. "Let me tell you how." She whispered some things into Ananse's ears, which caused him to smile wisely. "How brilliant that sounds," he said. "Of course, I can do that." The next morning, Ananse hurried towards the forest in search of the bees. Mr. B and his family were perched on some red flowers. They were far off from their hives in the trees and were buzzing and making a racket. Ananse climbed onto one of the branches and poured a whole calabash of water onto the ground. It looked like it was raining. Mr. B and his family were afraid. They thought it was raining. They didn't want to get wet. They wouldn't be able to fly. "Whatever shall we do now?" they asked. Come, enter my God and wait till the sun comes out, Ananse said. Ananse is a trickster, Mr. B's wife said. I wonder what he's up to. But Mr. B was more afraid of the rain. His whole family could easily be wiped out. I don't think it's a trick, he said. The bees flew into a dry gourd that Ananse was holding. He covered the gourd. It was very hot and dark inside it. Get us out of here now, the bees said. It's too hot and dark in here. Ha ha ha, Ananse laughed. This is nothing but a trap. Nananyami wants me to bring a full gourd of bees. I am taking you all the way to his palace. He carried the whole gourd of bees and took it to Nananyami. Well done, Ananse, Nananyami said, looking really astonished. Ananse was cleverer than he thought. Now, you must bring me Mr. Leopard, Nananyami said. How easy, Ananse said. How very, very easy. He thanked Nananyami and left the palace. As soon as he got out, he put both hands on his head and wailed as tears rolled down his cheeks. What a hard task! How can I bring the great leopard to Nananyami? What is it again? Aso asked when he got home. Nananyami wants me to bring the great leopard, Ananse cried. How is that possible? He rolled on the ground and cried like a baby. Oh, get up, Ananse, Aso said. It's very easy to catch Mr. Leopard. Ananse was really startled to hear her say this. Let me tell you how, she said, and whispered some things into his ears. Ananse stopped crying and looked at her lovingly. Then he started to laugh. Ha ha ha! What a smart woman you are, he said. Ananse hurried to the forest very early the next morning. He dug a hole in the ground and covered it with dry leaves. Soon the leopard came passing by like a king. He didn't watch where he was going. Plop! He fell into the hole. It was such a deep hole. Help! He cried. I will help you out, Ananse cried, but you must promise not to eat me. Of course I won't eat you, Mr. Leopard said. Ananse tied a long rope to a big tree and dropped it into the hole. Use the rope to climb out now, he said. He set a poisoned bow and arrow from a tree. It would make the leopard sleepy. As soon as the leopard climbed out of the hole, the arrow struck his head. He felt drowsy. What is happening? He asked. Ha ha ha! Ananse laughed. This is nothing but a trap, he said. Nananyami wants me to bring a leopard to him. I am taking you all the way to his palace. He used the rope to pull the sleepy leopard all the way to Nananyami's palace. Nananyami was surprised indeed. Ananse was really clever. Now, you have only one task ahead of you, he said. You must bring me Mr. Dwarf. That is the simplest of all the tasks, Ananse boasted. But when he got outside the palace, he put both hands on his head and wailed as tears rolled down his cheeks. This is the hardest task of all. How can I bring Mr. Dwarf? What again? His wife asked when he got home. Nananyami wants me to bring Mr. Dwarf, Ananse wailed. So, what is so difficult about that? Aso asked. Ananse was stunned. He looked at her in astonishment. See here, Aso said. Mr. Dwarf is in the middle of my palm. All I have to do is close my hand and squeeze him tight. Ananse looked in the middle of her palm. There was nothing there. Oh, come on, Ananse, Aso urged. Can't you see Mr. Dwarf in the middle of my palm? Of course, Mr. Dwarf was not in her palm. It was just her own way of saying that she could catch him easily. Look here, I can help you catch that silly dwarf, she boasted. Let me tell you how. She whispered some things in his ears which made him burst into laughter. Ha ha ha! How very, very smart you are! Very early the next morning, Ananse took a bowl of delicious yam pottage and some palm wine into the forest. He left them under a big tree and waited to see whether the dwarf would come for it. He waited and waited, but the dwarf did not come. Just when he was almost giving up, the dwarf came running into the forest. Whose yam pottage is this? The dwarf asked, looking around for the owner of the food. The food smelled so good that the dwarf could not resist. I will taste a little then, he said, looking all around to see if there was someone. Just a little bit? No one would even know. He took one handful of the food and another until it was finished. Next he asked, whose palm wine is this? I will sip a little to see if it tastes good, he said, looking all around to see if there was someone. Just a little bit. It won't do anyone any harm. He took one sip and then another until all the palm wine was gone. Now he was drunk. Ananse climbed down from the tree. He put the drunk dwarf on his shoulder. What is happening? The dwarf asked in a silly drunken voice. Ha ha ha! Ananse laughed. This is nothing but a trap. Nananyami wants me to bring a dwarf, and I am taking you right to the palace. He took Mr. Dwarf to Nananyami. Nananyami was so impressed with Ananse. He called for a big festival. Everyone wore their best dresses. Everyone ate and ate. Everyone drank and drank. Everyone danced and danced. Everyone said good things about Ananse. Then Nananyami made Ananse keeper of all the stories in the world. That is why all stories are called Ananse stories, even till today.